The store, called Ferocious Arms and Armory, was heavy with the scent of cured leather. Standing in front of the counter, Derek eyeballed the katana, giving each square inch the attention it deserved. Among the other gleaming weapons that hung on every wall of the shop, this one stood out. The red dragon printed on the sheath gave the sword style, and it felt good when he held it in his hands, as if the cold iron was a part of him. But it was best to consider a purchase of this magnitude with care. "Is it full tank?" "I reckon so," the old man behind the counter said, scratching at his gray facial hair. "Can it take edge-on-edge contact?" "No. No sword can. Not for long anyway. It's only in the movies that people slap swords around like that. It's a real good way to bend or break your weapon. Also, it's a $200 replica." Derek did his best to cut him a nasty look and said, "But it'll chop through. Like 3 cows, right?" The clerk rolled his eyes and gave a labored sigh. "Yeah. It'll cut through 5 or 6, and it'll really let you focus your chi to superhuman levels." The clerk rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm. "So, are you going to buy the thing or not? The mall is about to close and you've been looking at the sword for 2 hours." "Yep, I am." Derek wasn't positive, but it seemed as if the clerk's voice dripped with sarcasm. However, he'd resolved to let it slide for the sake of getting the sword. He yanked out the money, and the greedy clerk snatched the bills from his hands, then popped open the cash register. He stuffed the money in and said, "Cool, thanks for your business, but I got to close up shop now. I got bowling tonight, and I've been late 2 times this month. The guys in my league kinda frown on that." "Whatever." Derek grabbed the sword off the counter and walked out of the store a far more dangerous man than he had ever been. He clenched the sword within his hands as he walked the 3 miles back to his place in the dark. Once he arrived at his studio apartment, he cleared the Miller High Life cans and Monarch vodka bottles off of the coffee table and replaced them with the sword. He brushed his fingertips over the blade, and it sent a chill racing down his spine. One of his major life goals, owning a samurai sword, was complete, but it came with unexpected strings attached. The forces of the undead were amassing, and he seemed to be the only one that gave a crap. It's not like the world didn't know, they just didn't care. However, that sounded about right for humanity. They were, and always had been, procrastinators, and they always wanted someone else to save them from their own stupidity. Derek, as Atlas before him, would shoulder this burden and send the children of the night back into the shadows. He smiled as he assumed the lotus position on the somewhat sticky floor. He slid the sword off the coffee table and rested the blade on his lap as he said, "Dear Buddha, see that this sword is true, and guide it into the hearts of the undead. Let none stand without fear when this blade is used, and let all of the girls think it's completely awesome." Thus the sword became his holy weapon of destruction, and in a voice as deep as his vocal cords could permit he proclaimed, "I name you Fo Chopper." He raised the sword into the air, and the ceremony was almost complete. All he had to do now was christen it with undead blood, and that would come soon enough. After 3 hours of working out to sword practice videos he'd found on YouTube, he was sure no modern master could stop his speed, cunning and reflexes. He had an unnatural ability to learn the fighting arts. In fact, all he had to do was see a move once or twice and he was able to repeat it perfectly, so in his estimation he'd already mastered 6 different martial arts from YouTube and Kung Fu magazines alone. Since he'd received government funding a year ago, it allowed him to devote himself to his cause, and he would only get better and better. There was no stopping him. He cracked open a bottle of Blue Nun to celebrate, and didn't rest until it had been drained along with a few beers and a shot or 2 of vodka. When the world became too blurry from the alcohol, he crashed on top of his bed, and he couldn't help but imagine all the ways he'd use that blade to slice through the undead. The fighting would be like a perfect, yet brutal, ballet, and the night would know him by his code name forevermore. He wished to become the Dark Slayer, and that name would be on the lips of every hellish being that walked the earth. The sword lay beside him as he drifted off. The buzzing of the doorbell pulled him from the alcohol-induced coma that passed for sleep. Sure, he slept better than he had in years, But that didn't mean much as he usually only got a couple of hours in. He always felt ragged, and even with the extra sleep, he still had the hangover to contend with. Not many people came by these days, but he couldn't blame them. They wanted to keep living in their fantasy world where bad things didn't happen to good people, and the dead stayed dead. However, he wouldn't do it anymore. The more he accepted the world for the way it was, the less he could relate to others, and the more he reflected reality's harsh truths back at them, the more they feared him. It was sad, really. The lengths people would go to hide from what was going on never ceased to amaze him. The doorbell belted out its thin but insistent ring once more, and he shot from his bed. It could only be Miss Halloran, his governmental contact. He snatched the sword off of the bed and shoved it into his closet so she wouldn't see it. He didn't need any hassle about it not being a regulation weapon, and he sure as hell didn't need any flack about all the beer cans either. As an agent in training, he was not supposed to drink. However, it was the only thing that calmed him after his workouts, and it was the only way he could get any sleep. So, he grabbed the armful of cans and bottles off the coffee table and shoved them into the trash as he yelled, "Just a second." He sprinted to the small mirror on his wall and slapped his hair into shape, then rushed to the door. Derek put his eye up to the peephole, and he saw Miss Halloran's all-too-round face distorted by the fisheye lens of the hole. He lingered at the sight for a moment, just to make sure that no one else had followed her. Some might call it paranoid, but one could never be too careful when dealing with either the government or the undead. After a few moments of watching her pace in front of his door, he was satisfied she was still one of the good guys. His hand shot up to the deadbolt, and he unlocked the door. "Morning," she said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. She could be forward at times, but that was one of the things he liked about her. It was also one of the things he despised. "Morning," he repeated as he walked over to his sofa and plopped down. She shut the door behind her and strutted further into the room. "You haven't been to any of the meetings in a few weeks, Derek. Is everything okay?" He nodded, but said nothing. She never used his code name, and he was sure she did it just to piss him off. Although, he'd never been too adept at reading the female kind. She could have been coming on to him for all he knew. It didn't matter much to him either way. He had neither time for anger or sex. All that mattered was his first real mission, and that mission was happening tonight. Nothing would stop him from being ready. Besides, Miss Halloran, at best, could be described as frumpy. "Nope, haven't been to one in a little while." "Why not?" "We do the same shit, like, all the freaking time. I just don't get it and I hate going," he said. "Well, the others manage to show up. Every time. I don't think it can be that bad. Besides, attending those meetings is one of the things that got you here," she said, swirling her hands in the air to signal the apartment. She always had to threaten his funding. It was the first place she went to get him to do as she wanted, and she knew he couldn't say no. However, he wasn't going to give up without at least a little fight. "The government has billions of dollars, and the best they can do is toss to me a one-room apartment in the shittiest part of town. I'm not too impressed with the way they treat their people." Her face scrunched into a mix of exasperation and disgust as he spoke. They'd played this game too many times, and he knew what was going to come next. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small white bag and tossed it onto the coffee table. The bag rattled as it slid across the table and came to a stop on his pack of Camels. "You got to keep up with everything if you want it to stay like this." "I have been." He scratched at his stubble and continued, "Everything's been hard lately, but I said I'd keep your rules and I'm a man of my word." "I know you are, so could you just come to the meetings like you promised?" "Yeah. Whatever, Miss Halloran." She hated it when he called her Miss, but that was why he did it so often. "I'm not trying to be mean, but I feel you should use my proper title. I like you. However, we need to keep our roles clear." She glanced down at the floor and said, "I've stuck my neck out for you. I know, and I'm going to make you proud. I just need more time." She put her hands on her hips and sighed, "Okay, you can skip the next one, but you need to come to all the rest." I mean it. I'll be there. Okay. I'm going to leave you alone for now. I'll be back tomorrow so we can have a little more substantial talk." She looked around the room and grimaced. "Also, clean this place up. It smells like feet in here." "Sounds good. Let me know if you need any help." She opened the door and walked out. He spent that afternoon organizing his gear for his first mission. His nunchucks, throwing stars, wood stakes and homemade pipe bombs were either placed in his bag or on his tack vest, and when night fell he'd be ready for the gathering of the undead that was happening that night. Because he was taking action without clearance from Halloran, he was risking everything, but there were too many traitors within the organization's ranks to trust them with any of the details of his mission. It was going to be a sticky situation no matter what, but if he could take down a nest as large as the one he found by himself, they'd be forced to make him a full agent. He glanced down at the paper bag she'd tossed on the coffee table, and he snatched it up and stuck it in the tack vest. If something bad happened tonight he needed to be able to at least pretend he was playing by some of their rules when they called him in. As night fell, the Dark Slayer crouched in the trees outside the green two-story house at the end of Maple Avenue. The house itself was nice, at least, nicer than the mobile home he grew up in as a kid, but underneath it all was the stink of the undead. There were already 5 or 6 vamps in the house, and they sometimes glared out the windows looking for their comrades or checking for security threats. However, he was too well hidden in the dew-soaked underbrush that grew wild on the far left side of the house. As he crouched in the darkness, the damp and cold night air bit into him like a wild animal. It would have been more bearable if he'd wore more than his black sleeveless Metallica shirt. However, it was important that the vamps saw how ripped he was when he made his assault. His biceps were a powerful form of psychological warfare, and he needed to use every tool in his arsenal to take them down. He'd trained a long time for this, and a little cold weather couldn't stop him. He'd showed the organization he meant business, and they'd have to let him join. Hell, he'd come so far from where he started, and he'd shown too much gumption to be turned down now. At one time he'd been just like everyone else. He'd once thought the existence of vampires to be little more than a myth, but a documentary on the History Channel last Halloween showed him otherwise. At first the show just talked about boring historical stuff, but towards the end it brought on a few actual vampires. They were tall, nerdy-looking things, but underneath he could tell they were pure evil. They were dressed all in black, and even the men wore fingernail polish and lipstick, as if they were girls. The thought that people knew these creatures of the night roamed the streets ground on his nerves. He had begun his search for vampires soon after he'd seen the show, and it didn't take long to find them. They didn't even cover their tracks. For God's sake, they had websites, and still no one did a thing to stop them. He didn't read much of the site's content, but they had pictures all over them. He couldn't believe they could be so bold. But, the wicked often were, and that was the problem with the world. Evil gets right in everyone's face and no one stands up to it, but the Dark Slayer wasn't like everyone else. He was a man of action, and most of that action tonight would come from his razor-sharp, and completely bitching, samurai sword. This particular nest of vampires he found by accident while looking for research material at Wilson's Comics. The Dark Slayer wasn't much of a reader. He preferred to conduct his research in graphic novel form. Wilson's was a small place packed to the brim with cardboard boxes full of old comics and other things nerds like, and the musty pages of the books made the place reek. He didn't like the store much, but it was better than reading a Time Life book or a web page. So he'd been going for weeks just to gather information about the undead, and they had mountains of data on the subject. He couldn't believe his eyes as he walked into the store one dreary December night. The vamp was a little worm of a kid with thick-rimmed glasses, and his meekness made the Dark Slayer instantly aggressive. However, he contained the power within, and he let the kid be. After all, the Dark Slayer is a protector of the weak and helpless. But his Gentile stance was misguided. What lurked within that boy was pure evil, and he was ashamed his keen hunter instincts didn't pick up on it from the start. "Hey, Wilson, "You mind if I put this up on your board?" the kid asked the goofy shop owner. The kid's voice was as high-pitched as glass being chopped up in a blender, and that's when Derek discovered two things. 1. The kid was a vampire, and 2. That vampirism most likely stunts puberty. "What is it?" Wilson's fat lips flapped. "A vampire LARP, the undead monster said." "Yeah, whatever." The vampire trotted over to the cluttered bulletin board and pinned up a self-printed advertisement. The poster was black except for the picture at the top of an open mouth with fangs and bright red font that appeared to be dripping blood. The flyer spelled out their diabolical agenda as clear as possible, saying, "All undead are welcome to the first annual Undead LARP. Come one come all, and we'll have ourselves a vampire ball. We play the Gathering or other White Wolf types of systems." In smaller block letters underneath it stated, "It starts at 7 p.m. January 14th. Call 907-347-2254 for further details or simply show up at 326 Maple Avenue. The sign will be out front by the mailbox. Just knock on the door." It was as if liquid nitrogen had been injected into Derek's veins, but he played it cool. He couldn't let the enemy see his distress. After the vamp left, he ripped down the sheet and just glared at it for a while. When the incredible weight of all its implications rolled off of him, he marched up to the store owner with the leaflet clenched in his fists and tossed it at him. "What the hell is this?" the Dark Slayer shouted. "Yo, dude, what up? What up? Are you one of them?" "Hell, no, I've never LARPed a day in my life. If you ever accuse me of that again, you can just get the hell out of my store." "I don't believe it." "Dude, calm down. They're good loyal customers, and they're just holding their little nerd party." "Nerd party?" "Yeah, they just go there and have a good time. I don't give a crap what they do. It's weird to me, but to each his own. I mean, they spend a lot of cash in here, so I'll tolerate a little weirdness from them. It's all just nerd pretend, dude." Wilson tossed the leaflet back at Derek, and it hit him in the chest and rolled to the floor. The question as to why vampires wanted to pretend to be nerds was a mystery to Derek, but he had too much of the collaborator known as Wilson to care. He snatched the paper off the ground and stormed off. That's how he'd come to the house on Maple Avenue, and he'd finish what he'd started. He'd been hiding in the woods for nearly 3 hours, and his hand was starting to ache from the stranglehold he kept on the faux chopper's hilt. Derek didn't like to admit it, but the cold was getting to him. He pried his hands off the hilt of the sword and shoved them into his tack vest. He wasn't trying to warm them, just looking for his bottle of rum. When his hands found the plastic bottle, Derek jerked it out, and along with it came the bag Miss Halloran had given him. He snatched up the bag, ripped it open and pulled out the small amber bottle that lay within. Even in the dark, he could make out the horrid black letters printed on it. Thorazine. Dr. Halloran. Take orally, initial dose, 25 mg 3 times daily. He popped open the bottle and dropped a few of the pills to the ground. When the organization took him back in, he wanted to be able to say he'd at least taken some of them. As the pills hit the dead leaves carpeting the woods, a rusted-out red van pulled into the driveway, and vamps piled out, dressed as if they'd taken fashion advice from Morticia Adams. All wore black and held cases of beer, bags of chips, or bottles of wine. There were about 5 of them in all, and slithering among them was the same gaunt nerdy vampire he'd seen at the comic shop. The Dark Slayer slammed what was left of his rum and tossed the bottle to the ground. Clenching the hilt of his sword, he sprang from the underbrush. The Dark Slayer sprinted across the lawn and into the yellow glow of the floodlights. One of the vampires, posing as a young teen girl, spotted him as he closed in on his target. She pointed and let out a scream. Her eyes were wide and a look of terror was slapped across her face. Derek jumped over a flower bed and onto the driveway. The hard rubber soles of his Vietnam jungle boots clacked on the asphalt as he rushed towards the target. Despite the girl's screams, the poor bastard never saw it coming, and with one quick strike the sword slashed into the back of the nerdy vampire. The vamp let out a low whine as the Dark Slayer brought the sword down again, and he smacked the top of his head. Blood gushed from his wounds as the vamp crashed to the ground, and cries of fright rose from the lips of every undead soul that stood there. Derek had caught them off guard, and now they were going to be chopped into pieces, along with the rest of the vamps in the house. Miss Dr. Halloran would be shocked at how good he was when she saw this. If she wasn't, it just meant she was a sympathizer. The end. Credit to Jeremy Bennett. End. Credit to Jeremy Bennett. End. Credit to Jeremy Bennett. The last time we saw Eric, the group of us were hanging out in our usual restaurant, pissing off the staff as usual by being too rowdy and mostly drinking coffee. We did order big appetizers now and then, and we tipped well, so when they waitresses did give us grief, it was mostly good-natured. I think the group of us weirdos were their nightly entertainment, truth be told. We didn't all meet there every night, of course. Some nights nobody showed up and other times it was close to the whole group. This particular night I think there was a half dozen or so. There were perhaps a dozen of us total, depending on who you considered the core group and who you considered hangers-on. Eric was in that gray area between the two, until that night. From the moment he came in the door, we knew something was horribly wrong. He could barely stand, and he was white as a sheet. His hands were shaking visibly, and you could see white all the way around his eyes. We made room for him fast, and Juju ordered coffee for him twice, black, in case he was drunk, and decaf, in case he was pissed off. He was pissed off. Scared, and pissed off. He didn't say anything at first. I am not sure he could even understand our questions. I got a real bad sinking feeling in my stomach and I squirmed away from the overstuffed booth. I went to the door to the parking lot and took a look at his truck. Sure enough, there was something smeared all over the front. But in the lighting there I couldn't be sure if it was blood. Choking down bile, I took an old napkin out of my pocket and swept it along the stain. Whatever it was hadn't dried quite yet. It was reddish, but mostly clear and shot through with black oil. I went back to the booth to hear what he had to say. He blinked hard, like he was trying to wake himself from a bad dream, and took off his trucker's hat, a rare enough occurrence that we knew it was bad to comb his greasy fingers through his unkempt, straw-colored, dirty hair. Finally he spoke, furrowing his brow. His gaze became intense, angry. She's fucking with me. I saw one or two of the others kind of relax a bit. Girl trouble, they were thinking, was that all? But I just set my jaw and stared at him. After a moment, he saw my eyes over his coffee cup and grimaced, maybe at the horrible coffee, maybe at me. Fucking with me. He clarified. Ruby? I asked. That was the name of the last girl he had gone out with. I think. He blinked in confusion for a second. Ruby? Oh hell nah. I might have wanted to run her over with my truck but I never. He trailed off. I saw some of the gang glancing at each other around the table. They were catching on. Cap adjusted his baseball cap. He put on a big smile and an exaggerated relaxed attitude, but he kept his voice low. Funny you should say that, Rick. Kind of thought you might have hit a deer on the way here, the way you looked. Nate glanced over at me right after he said that, but I held my gaze neutral. I could not be sure I'd seen blood on the front of his truck, and for that matter it didn't look all dented up like it should have if he had grazed a deer. Besides, Eric was enough of a jerk that hitting deer didn't faze him. Like most things, it just pissed him off. Cap can handle himself in a fight, but the rest of us kind of braced. Juju looked at Eric all sympathetic, which was genuine, coming from her. None of us expected Eric to start laughing. It kind of burst out of him, and we started to relax, thinking maybe this was some kind of gotcha. It was the kind of thing Eric would have pulled if he was a little smarter and a little less lazy. But the laughter went on too long, and it kinda started to sound like crying at the end there. Yeah, I hit a deer, he said finally, as the laughter died out of him. DEAR. He let that sink in, while he drank his coffee. Juju's hand went to her mouth. She stared, silent, as the implications set in. Cap's expression grew dark, which was expected and bad. When he got serious, people got hurt. He was the main man to have on your side in a problem, but you didn't ever want to be the problem. We weren't sure just yet whether Eric was the problem, but the odds were not in his favor. Cap thought for a moment. Is she in the truck? Eric shook his head, which Cap did not like. Is she lying on the road, Rick? A dark chuckle, and another head shake. Is she in the ground? Eric spoke this time. Hell no. He looked Nate right in the eye. She's up, walking around. Cap matched him glower for glower. Is she hurt? Eric put down his cup and sat a moment, so we could all see the sincerity in his face. No, she ain't hurt, Nate. She ain't hurt at all, because she's dead. Now we all knew that what Eric was saying was impossible. But we also all knew he meant it. So that meant he had gone crazy. We were all stunned into silence for a moment, and when the chatter started up, he held up a hand to halt it. He shrugged off his own anger, more like stored it away for a bit, and gestured for Eric to continue. We were his friends, after all, and we had all seen weird things. We had to make the effort to believe him. I blame Foghat. He started with that, and a few of us chuckled and nodded. No one sane would ride with Eric at the best of times, but the song Slow Ride made him crazy behind the wheel. I was taking the old Valley Highway into town specifically so I wouldn't have to deal with idiots on the road. I guess I was a little loopy. It was a bad combination. There was no way anyone should have been on that road at the time of night, but there she was. A deer in my headlights. He gave each of us a sour look, and then continued. You have to understand. It was not my fault. I was driving too fast, sure, and my reflexes were slow, sure. I admit that. But the thing is, she was too close to me too fast. Even on my best day, in broad daylight, at 5 miles under the speed limit, I still would have hit her. You have to understand that. We all nodded, understanding we didn't really feel. Whether he swallowed our act or not was irrelevant. He continued, the pump had been primed. I stood on the brakes, or as close to it as I could get without jackknifing the truck. I will never forget the way she looked. She had this funny expression on her face. Not fear, not exactly surprise. I saw it for a brief instant, and then her body bounced. Unable to contain herself, Juju interrupted him with a quiet sob. Cap put his hand on her shoulder. I grimaced inwardly. Whatever else happened, Eric was going to get a bust in the jaw for making her cry. But not here and now. Eric had the floor. I got out of the cab and ran back to the end of the truck. She was all broken and torn. Her eyes stared. I have EMT training, you know. So I checked. I checked for a pulse, you know. I wanted her to be alive so bad. If I had made a mistake, it would have been the other way. I would have thought she was alive when she wasn't. But I didn't make a mistake, I know that now. My phone got no bars, which was no surprise. So I went back to the truck to get on the radio. Nothing but static, which was a surprise. It was weird. Even in the valley, I usually get reception on the radio. So what was I supposed to do? If I stayed where I was, I'd cause another accident, or someone would see her body on the road and swerve. So I decided to put her in the truck. It wasn't like I was going to make her any deader, you know? So I climbed back out of the cab, and looked to the back of the truck, and she was gone. Now I know what you are thinking, because I was thinking it then, too. She was just stunned or something. She had gotten up and wandered off, maybe into the woods. I had to find her, or else she would just wander until she got eaten by a bear or something. I didn't want her to suffer. So I set flares, went out into the woods with my lamp, and I must have wandered around yelling, "Hey! Girl!" for like an hour. I didn't manage to do anything but spook myself. The woods were tall and black as pitch. Every snap of a twig was a bear or a wolf. My white breath puffing into the darkness was a reminder that I was alive, and that the girl was dead or dying. And the whole time, I was worried about some joyriding kids getting out onto that road and smacking into my truck or something. I admit, by the time I got back to the truck, I was a wreck. I didn't know what else to do. with no radio and no phone and no girl. I picked up my flares and started home. It was about a half hour later, when my nerves had just about started to calm down and my brain started to work, when I hit her again. We all glanced at each other. We could feel the crushing weight of guilt in his every word, so we could imagine what tricks his mind had played on that lonely road. In our glances, we conversed, with something like telepathy. Should we stop him? Should we head out to the old road right now and look for the girl? In the end, we decided to let him talk. Just like before. He was staring into his coffee like he could reheat it with his gaze. Suddenly she was in front of me, too close for me to stop. My headlights washed over her, and this time I understood the expression on her face. It was Lee. I couldn't help shaking my head a little to myself. Rationalization. She had wanted to be hit, therefore it wasn't his fault. I hoped to myself that therapy could fix denial this deep. The time after that, and the time after that, and each time, her face held more and more joy before it was mashed into oblivion. I started driving crazy slow, and finally traffic from behind caught up to me, a sea of traffic, honking, uncaring. I saw the exit to the diner, and here I am. Cap stood. He started pulling on his jacket. Eric stood. He put a hand on Cap's arm, but he pulled it back right quick when he saw the look Cap gave him. You can't go out there, man. You don't understand what's out there and neither do I. Cap simply said. Sun's up. We can find the body now. She's got family somewhere. They deserve to know what happened. Eric ducked his head guiltily, then covered it with bravado. I ain't going out there again. I don't want you to. Stay here. Drink coffee. I will deal with this. Eric blinked. Gratitude spread across his features, quickly followed by stubborn pride and concern. I saw him try to think hard, also rare, and then he started laughing again. The sound was high, strained and completely fake. I got you. Hey, I got you all. You should have seen the looks on your stupid faces. Hee-hoo. Well, I'm going to be telling this one for a while. See you all later. He squared his shoulders when Cap stepped into his path. Eric looked away when Cap talked. I am going up there anyway. Eric looked back at Cap. His eyes looked moist. Not if I can stop you. The two men squared shoulders at each other, and the thought occurred to me to clear furniture out of the way. It was at that moment that a couple of thankfully oblivious cops entered. Eric seized his chance and walked right out past them, almost brushing shoulders with them, and earning a suspicious glance. Cap, who had a long and unhappy history with cops, turned away. A moment later, Eric's truck roared out of the parking lot, and I never saw him alive again. Sourly, Cap came back to the booth and sat. We should go out there, we should find the girl, say we happened upon whatever stain in the road there is where she got hit, followed it back to wherever her body is. It's just the responsible thing to do. I nodded. But we should hold up until those cops leave, I said. If the timetable on our story matches up with them being here, it could look bad. Cap furrowed his brow, frustrated with having to wait, but he nodded. For nearly an hour, we prodded our cold food and drank the bad coffee. The cops finally left, our community's finest were on the job again. We settled the bill, and I stopped myself just before accidentally wiping my mouth on the sample of whatever that I had taken from Eric's truck. Whatever was on it was jet black now, with the barest hints of red. It was thicker now, congealed into something like syrup. It smelled strange, pungent but not completely unpleasant. It made me think of maggots. My stomach roiling, I discarded it in the nearest wastebasket. It was at that moment that the little girl entered the restaurant. The waitstaff stopped and stared, stunned, as did we. She looked like 7 kinds of hell, and she was grinning as if she'd just been told to get ready to go to Disneyland. The only sound was static from the radio behind the counter. Her feet were bare and covered, no caked, in mud. She carried a scuffed and torn pair of Mary Janes in one hand. Her clothes were nothing but rags, pasted to her form with a combination of mud and some darker substance. Maybe they had been a nice blue dress once, it was impossible to tell. You could even make out a pattern something like tire treads in places. More disturbing to us who had heard Derek's story was the fact that the girl, despite the condition of her clothes, looked perfectly fine. Every tooth was in place in her little head. Her hair was matted and streaked with mud, tangled with leaves, but it was all there. She didn't have a bruise or scrape anywhere you could see. It was almost enough to make one think she was indeed part of some elaborate prank, if you hadn't seen Eric's eyes. Her eyes were also strange. At first they looked like the perfect blue eyes you would expect on a little girl in a TV commercial, but after a moment you caught it. They did not track naturally, almost as if she were navigating by hearing alone, or some stranger sense. And she didn't blink nearly often enough. She pranced right up to the counter in front of us as if she was in her Sunday best. Maybe she was. "Excuse me, miss," she said cheerily. "Have you seen a truck driver come in here in the last hour or so?" The counter girl shook her head no, unsteadily. The statement was technically true. "How disappointing," she said, flouncing a little in exaggerated frustration. "I really had been hoping to find my playmate. We were having so much fun." I realized, as utter cold crept up my spine, that we weren't looking at a little girl. We were looking at something that was pretending to be a little girl, something that had learned its mannerisms by rote, or which was recalling them from a distant memory. Suddenly she cocked her head to one side, and made a beeline right for us. We parted like the Red Sea before Moses, and she proceeded to the wastebasket where I had discarded the sample. She plucked the napkin from its place and regarded it for a moment, not quite sniffing it, but with a similar cant to her shoulders. "He's been here," she said. "You can't wipe me away that easily." With that she proceeded out the set of doors that Eric had used to reach the parking lot. She twirled in place a few times, and then headed off, skipping. We all looked at each other. I think we all collectively decided, with something like telepathy, to act as if Eric had indeed pranked us with some elaborate joke. Juju tried to get him on the phone, but all of a sudden she couldn't get any bars. We sat back down at the booth and tried over and over again. Eventually we got cell phone reception back, but calls to him went straight to voicemail. We never did get up to the Valley Highway that day. I guess we figured there was nothing there for us to find. Credit to Kitsune Ninetails. Credit to Kitsune Ninetails. Credit to Daddy calls me his princess. I feel like one too, especially when I'm wearing one of my princess crowns. My daddy makes them for me. He's an artist, you see. Every once in a while, Daddy says he has a present for me. It's a box, usually wrapped in pretty sparkly paper with a bow on top. I get a big smile on my when I see it. I tear the paper off and open the box and pull out the thin, noisy paper, and my smile gets even bigger. It's Daddy's latest princess crown, all for me, and it's beautiful. They're always beautiful. Daddy started making princess crowns after my mommy left. I remember watching her leave. She had a big brown suitcase. I still don't know why she didn't tell me goodbye or when she'd be home. Daddy says she's not coming home, but I think she will one day. I remember when Daddy gave me my first crown, 2 years ago. I was 6. I remember before I opened it, Daddy looked scared, like he was afraid I wouldn't like it. I loved it, and I wore it every day until he gave me the second one. I have 9 now. One of my favorite crowns has pieces of silver on it. Daddy gave it to me last year. I love how it sparkles in the sunlight. I've only seen it sparkle in the sunlight that comes in through the windows, though. Daddy won't let me take it outside. He won't let me take any of my princess crowns outside. He doesn't want them to get broken. When I have a friend over, Daddy makes sure all of the princess crowns are in the crown room. That's where he keeps them safe. It's where he makes them, too. I've never been in the crown room, and I've tried, but Daddy always keeps it locked, and I don't know where the key is. I'm not allowed to show my friends the crowns because Daddy thinks we'll break them or one of my friends will steal them. That's why I can't tell my friends about the crowns, either. If I do tell, He'll never make another one, and he'll throw them all away. I don't want that. I love my princess crowns. Hey princess, Daddy says to me with his smile. He says, I've got a present for you, and I see the box behind him on the dinner table, all sparkly with a pretty bow on top. I smile big and run over to it. I tear off the bow and the paper and open the box. I pull out the noisy, thin yellow paper until I see it, and I smile even bigger. It's beautiful. My daddy points out what he did with the teeth on this one. I try it on and see what he means. 3 teeth in each side fit snugly between my locks to keep my new princess crown in place. I look in the mirror. It's beautiful. I look like a princess. Then I notice, this crown still has food on it. I take the crown off and look at Daddy. Usually, he's the only one allowed to clean the food off. He smiles and nods, which means he left some just for me. I pick the meat off with my teeth. It's yummy. I put my crown back on my head and smile at my reflection. Then I look at Daddy, who smiles back at me. I love my daddy. I'm his princess. Post views, 854. Please wait. Jake shouldn't be outside tonight, let alone walk through the woods by himself. But he's just gonna drop by his friend's house real quick to pick up his phone, which he forgot there a few days ago. How much harm can that really do? A damp, blue-tinted fog silently prowls the night, meandering through the towering trees. The moon has deprived the sun of its throne in the sky, and the repetitive sound of his sneakers hitting the dirt road is the only thing accompanying him. With the soft harmonies of solitude cascading through the forest comes complete tranquility. You can really tell that there's almost no one outside right now. A different kind of smell drifts with the wind, and a different kind of air fills his lungs each time he takes a breath. The sensation of undisturbed nature is a pretty rare thing nowadays. Maybe the rumors of this night and why you should stay inside was all made up by people who wanted to enjoy this once every year. A bush rustles somewhere behind him. Jake stops in his tracks and pricks up his ears. Nothing but the distant hooting of an owl. Trying not to make anything of it, he continues walking the narrow path in front of him. He only gets to take a couple of steps, though, before he hears another rustle, and freezes instantly. The sound is a little closer to him this time, but when he spins around to face the bush, he sees nothing. Must be a squirrel or something. Maybe a cute little fox. The bottom line is, it's nothing to worry about. Jake presses on, but the air that fills his lungs is now flavored with paranoia, which pumps out through his veins like a malicious virus. He tries to calm himself down, but when the third rustle comes, there's no doubt that he's scared. He quickens his pace and keeps his eyes steadily on the road. Maybe he should have stayed inside. He could have just gone to get his phone in the morning. Why does he always feel the need to be a rebellious idiot? That was a footstep. Yep, that was definitely a freaking footstep landing a few meters behind him. He knows now that something is there in the forest with him, something that's not a cute little animal. But he won't look back. That's what you should never do. Instead, Jake keeps walking determinedly towards the edge of the woods with fear rising up inside of him like in a thermostat. The rhythmical footsteps keep closing up on him. It seems like no matter how fast he walks, the footsteps behind him are set to always walk just a little bit faster. He can't get away from them. And when he starts hearing the wheezing breathing filled with gurgling fluid from the unknown being creeping up on him, panic breaks loose. Jake runs. He runs as fast as anyone of his height and weight can, but he knows in the back of his mind that it won't be enough. The thing behind him keeps the same rhythm to its footsteps but now moves like a galloping horse, inhumanly fast. The rapid and shallow breathing coming down his neck sounds excited, and he can almost hear a little bit of crazed laughter emitting from his pursuer. The trees of the forest fly by quickly, and the outer parts of Jake's vision blurs. He feels the air around him get colder, and the light from the moon getting choked by dark clouds. A hand violently grabs his hood, and his head is thrown forward before he falls heavily to the ground. Jake slowly turns his head as he lies there, helpless. He is met by a lucid pair of big white eyes, and the tall body of a man, looming over him. The man's hair is disheveled, and under the long, dark coat, his skin is pale and filled with deep cuts. The mere presence of his lacerated soul makes Jake dizzy. Even now, while standing still, the man taps his feet in that same rhythm, and the shaky smile on his face expresses maniacal delight. He bends over slowly and takes Jake's hand. His fingers feels bony and frozen. Then, all of a sudden, an electric feeling bolts through Jake. It's like nothing he's ever felt before. Jake stands up with eyes wide open and feels euphoria flow through him. The rhythm seizes him. And while preserving the peace and silence of nature, he and the man dance away through the forest together. It is said in Jake's town that once every year, the dead rise from their graves. For one night, the ones who lived miserable lives get the chance to experience fun. And what better way to have fun than through dancing? The children are taught to stay inside on this night, however. Because everyone knows that dancing is better when you're two. Credit to Daniel S. Credit. She has her mother's bright blue eyes, Daddy's little angel does. And the most beautiful smile you've ever seen. She could melt an iceberg, she could. Everyone that knows her just loves her to death, and I'm so proud to call myself her father. She's a gift from above, I know it, which is why I must protect her, no matter what the cost. Some people just don't understand. It all started a couple of weeks ago. Some nasty little girl was teasing Katie, my little angel, and she just wouldn't leave her alone. She was saying nasty things, saying how poor she was and saying she was dirty and such. She just had the filthiest mouth. Little girls shouldn't be so nasty. Well, she followed Katie home that day, throwing dirt at her and telling her to take a bath in it. Well, my Katie showed her what's what, yes she did. And Daddy couldn't be more proud. I don't think anyone should hurt a child, even if they don't mean it. Don't get me wrong. But Katie never did anything to anyone, and I love her to death. You've got to understand. I was only being a loving father when I hid the body. You see, we live in a very rural area, and that nasty-mouthed little girl clearly had no business following my Katie in the first place, but I know no one would understand, and I just can't let anything happen to my little angel. Of course, that's when my wife came home and saw that our little girl had a few bruises. Can you believe she actually glared at me? As if I'd ever so much as think of hurting my little angel. Of course I was upset, but the sweetheart that she is, Katie set her on track sure enough. She told her how the filthy little girl harassed her and wouldn't leave her be. And I tell you, that lit my wife right up. She was so angry. I had to restrain her. She was gonna call her parents then and there. It was 9 in the evening. Well, I finally talked her down, even though she was furious with me that I hadn't handled it sooner. Of course by then she just didn't trust me to settle it no matter what I told her. I said I'd do it first thing after work the next day, but no. She insisted she'd call them herself the next day. Even Katie pleaded with her not to call her parents. She said she'd be so embarrassed at school if everyone found out. She'd run home and told Mommy. Of course we both knew we couldn't explain that the filthy little girl had gone missing after their little scuffle. Now could we? I mean, she's my wife and I loved her. But she just wouldn't understand. But she just sent Katie straight up to bed and wouldn't hear another word from me on the matter. Her mind was made up. And she's a very headstrong woman. It's part of her charm, you see, so there's no arguing with her once she's made up her mind on a matter. Well, after that I went to tuck the little angel in and read her a bedtime story, and she begged me not to let Mommy call the filthy girl's parents, but I told her how persistent Mommy is, and that she wouldn't listen to me. Of course that didn't sit well with Katie at all. She knew that Mommy wouldn't understand. And neither would her schoolmates' Mommy. No, especially not her. I told Katie I would think of something, and I promised that I wouldn't let anything happen to her. But Daddy's little angel is clever. Daddy's little angel already had her mind made up. I shoulda understood. The next day I came home to see my wife lying at the bottom of the stairs in a crumpled bloody heap. There was so much blood, and it had long since dried into the carpet when I got home. She had never made it to work that morning. The official story was that she had taken a nasty fall down the stairs and cracked her head open like an egg on her tumble. But as I look into Katie's eyes, so empty, so emotionless. No, no, no. Daddy's little angel did not hurt anyone that didn't try to hurt her first. She's special. Anyhow, there was a funeral and a whole family showed up. Katie couldn't have been more bored. She just sat there staring into nothingness as the eulogy was given. When it came time to view the corpse, she barely gave it a glance. I like to think she's coping with the loss her own way. Daddy's little angel loved her mommy more than anything. It was just before the burial the next day that an investigator showed up at the door. It was Katie that answered as I was rushing to get ready. I rushed to the door as this man was questioning my little girl, gently scooted Katie out of the way and stepped up to the door. "May I help you?" I asked, trying to sound polite. "I need to ask you some questions about the circumstances of your wife's death," the investigator said. "Who are you?" I think some of my frustration was coming through, but it might have been my self-consciousness. "I'm sorry," he said with a laugh. "Detective Kimball, local PD. I just got the results back from the autopsy, and the blunt trauma your wife suffered, and the bloodstains found on the carpet don't exactly match up. I was wondering if you could give me a little more insight." "Well, I'd love to, Detective, but as I told the responding officers, I only found the body when I came home from work. I wasn't here to see it happen." The detective tried to speak again, I think, but I cut him off. Frustration was filling me. "If you'll excuse me, we have a burial to attend." I grabbed Katie's hand and walked her out the door, locking it behind me. I glanced back to see that the detective was watching me as we drove away. Katie was silent the entire trip there and back, and as soon as we got home she retreated to her room. The poor baby has it so rough, all this death surrounding her. I shampooed the carpet the best I could to get the stains out, and fixed up dinner for us. We ate in silence, and it filled me with pain to see her suffering. I'll never forget, just before she got up to take her plate to the sink, she looked at me and smiled so softly. Oh, my little angel has the sweetest smile you ever did see. A couple days passed, and I thought things were getting back to normal, well, as normal as they could be, without my beautiful wife to come home to when it happened. You see, I rush home each day to meet Katie as she's coming in from school, but yesterday I was lost in thought and took my time getting home. You see, the day before my wife's sister suggested that she come over and bring Katie's cousin to visit, and I couldn't refuse. So I had to get in the mindset. I had to show her we were coping. The house was quiet when I got there, but that wasn't so unusual as Daddy's little angel tends to keep to herself and spends most of her time in her room playing with her dollhouse. She's always so clean, and always so quiet. I couldn't have asked for a better little girl. I walked up to check Katie's room and it was empty. I then proceeded to check the rest of the house and found her nowhere, until I came to the door leading to the cellar. Odd, it was cracked. I pushed it open and started down the stairs. I could see the light spilling across the floor at the bottom of the staircase, illuminating a small puddle of blood just a foot from the bottom step. "Just hand me the gun," a voice said softly. "I'll get you out of here, take you somewhere safe." I rushed down the stairs and found Katie standing a mere 2 feet away from Detective Kimball, who sat bound with rope and bleeding from the head. I approached my daughter and eased the gun from her hands as the detective seemed to eye me with the most dreadful gaze anyone's ever given me in my life. I took the gun in my hands, and was surprised at how natural it felt, though I'd never held a gun in my life. The exhilaration that filled me as I lifted the gun and watched the detective's face contort in horror almost sickened me. "Why have you come?" I asked him as I aimed the gun at his head. "Your wife's death was not an accident," he replied. "I was at work when it happened, and Katie was at school. It's been deemed an accident." "What did you hope to find here?" "The coroner stated that she died in the early morning, around the same time you leave for work." I loved my wife. Unconsciously I began to pull the hammer back. "If you kill me, the police will know where to look," Kimball pleaded. "There's no way out of this. Do the right thing. Do it for your little girl. If only you understood." I put a bullet in his head. It's all I could do. Of course I knew he was right. I knew the cops would come soon, looking for him. I turned to my girl. She stood staring at Kimball, vacantly, and I told her to run and get the tarp from the corner. She did. Daddy's little angel is so good, she even helped me wrap the body. And I carved. My sister-in-law showed up that night with her husband and kid, as she said she would, and dinner was ready by 8:30. I really think they loved it, my new recipe. I think they'll be back for more. Credited to Chris Phoenix, post views, 114,641. Please wait. If you have spent any length of time in the United States, you owe it to yourself to play the 1985 arcade classic, Paperboy. In it, you assume the role of a preteen boy tasked with completing his daily paper route. For whatever reason, your hero's beat is a particularly rough neighborhood. Its streets teem with aggressive drivers who would rather hit a cyclist than their brakes. On the sidewalks, bratty children steer kamikaze RC cars into passers-by, modern-day drone pilots in their larval form. Elsewhere, skateboarding adrenaline junkies find their greatest thrill in demolishing live obstacles like your Paperboy. In some cases, your character will be accosted by a knife-wielding madman who comes charging out of a house and pursues at tremendous speed, inevitably catching your hero and robbing him of a precious life. Taken as a whole, the game makes for an effective satire of Reagan-era America. It captures the needless paranoia of the suburbs, where people fear the harm some stranger or foreign power will inflict on them, without realizing the vanity, in all senses of the word, behind such a phobia. It shows the violence and cruelty of the average American percolating behind the facade of white picket fences and well-maintained lawns. Most importantly, it reveals how far some people will go to make a buck, or be compelled to go, for socioeconomic reasons beyond their control. It would be troubling to consider these situations if the game didn't make it all so damn funny. Odds are you will laugh too much while playing to think about many of the concerns the game raises. Perhaps it succeeds too well at its own satirical objectives. You would be forgiven for assuming that the same merry cynicism found in Paperboy would carry over to its 90s console sequel, Paperboy 2. Indeed, the second entry in the series contains every bit as much unnecessary peril, and consequent weird humor, as the first. You guide your choice of Paperboy or Papergirl through a suburban gauntlet featuring a whole new cast of memorable hostels. A hermit holed up in a moat-ring castle bombards you with cannon fire as you pass. Overzealous guard dogs chase you down the street. Roasting pigs, knocked off the spit by a misfired newspaper, do the same, evidently being grilled alive before your intervention, and none too happy with your interference. Runaway baby carriages, in a nod to the overpopulation worries of the modern world, mow you down if you are not attentive enough. Scarecrows, once hit with a paper, break from their stakes and ambush you, one hand raised in a fascist salute all the while. The absurdity in Paperboy 2 runs high thanks to the game's colorful cast. Although perhaps colorful is not the right word. As you play through the opening stages of Paperboy 2, you will notice one character who does not seem to belong, for he is, literally and figuratively, anything but colorful. He will first catch your eye because his palette is without color. He is the only person in the game rendered entirely in monochrome. He wears a gray sweatsuit. His neat and unremarkable hair is black. His star-white skin, however, is especially arresting, given the more nuanced flesh tones seen everywhere else in game. His actions, too, are comparably bland. If left undisturbed, the figure in gray simply walks down his driveway, deposits a garbage can at the curb, then turns around and walks back to his house. If struck with a paper, he only freezes in his tracks. No attacks, no surprises. He is shockingly mundane in this world of cannons and mobile scarecrows. If you have some knowledge of 90s news curiosities, you might be able to excavate the unusual case of one Dennis R. from your memory banks. Assuming the national news outlets had the story straight, and reported it accordingly, Mr. R. was an actuary, or some other specialist whose profession hinges on the unchallenged yet specious assumption that the future will be like the past, who woke up one night, dismembered his infant twin sons and his wife of 8 years, and brought their remains to the curb in a metal garbage can alongside all the other refuse of suburban life. The mechanical arm of the waste collection truck had not detected the can's abnormal weight, and the landfill, too, was none the wiser. It was entirely possible that nobody would have noticed the absence of Mrs. R. and her children, had the local library not begun to seek compensation for a long overdue book that Mrs. R. never had the chance to return. Alas, Mr. R. was never properly sentenced, as he was killed in prison by other inmates before his trial could be finished. Recalling this story, you might begin to sense a resemblance between the late Mr. R. and the figure in gray. Indeed, after a cursory image search for his photograph on the internet, you would be impressed by how uncanny a likeness a few pixels can produce. You might even begin to suspect that the satire of the Paperboy series is alive and well in the second installment. Here the game designers have given you a world of crime and violence and fright, and yet the most horrible thing in it is something as innocuous as a man taking out his trash. Here all the paranoid suburbanites target a kid on a bicycle, as if he or she posed any actual threat, while the real danger lurks next door. You might speculate that Paperboy 2 is a satire of complacency, where prosperity and habit inure the average American against diligence and introspection, where the idealized image of the suburb discourages its residents from looking beyond the glistening veneer of civilization, and scrutinizing themselves or others. Even you, the attentive player, were fooled. Did you think to inspect the gray figure's garbage can for pixelated limbs? Of course not. Why would you? The world you find yourself in does little to suggest that you should have. Therefore, through the inclusion of this nonchalant figure in gray, the game makes you complicit in the poisonous mindsets that suburban America incubates, a mature critique indeed for such an early video game. Yet if you were to praise the developers of Paperboy 2 for their clever stunt, not one of them would take credit for it. For none of them would admit to drawing or programming the figure in gray. In fact, none of them would remember putting him into the game. Credit to Lex Joy into the game. Written below are the journal entries of Christopher Young, brother of Daryl Young, found saved as individual files on his personal computer, with file names prologue, doc, ch1.doc, ch2.doc, etc. Apart from being compiled into one document, they have not been altered in any way. Prologue. 2 weeks later, there was a sound, there was a humming. It came from that place on the carpet, the spot near the corner. His spot. ch1. I'm getting concerned. I guess I was a bit distracted before, but my mind is clear now. They're gone, and I am frankly growing more concerned by the minute. A chalk-white amorphous thing. A hideous, absolutely hideous thing. I saw it. I saw it on the rug, and it scared me. It looked at me, grinning with half-formed white eyes filmed over. It writhed towards me. A heat, some sort of sickening heat radiated from it, and it saw my disgust and thrived upon it. I had hoped it would live in one of the closets, but it was content to ooze about my home, leaving trails as it went. I am quite sure that if I had not put the towel under the bathroom door it would have tried to come in and join me while I bathed myself. ch2. Today it has appendages. I am not sure if they existed before, but now they most certainly do. It has two, with one on either side. And it crawls haphazardly along like some sort of horrid lopsided insect. It tried to follow me out through the door, but I kicked it and it did not try any longer. It thumps around as I try to sleep, dragging its body everywhere and leaving residue all over the house. I took my cat to Daryl's. The thing didn't follow me. I'm glad. It may get me, but it will not get my cat. ch3 and now has 4 appendages and is beginning to form a skull-like dome under its pulsing skin. It has a mouth, a crooked little mouth, and I am afraid it will begin to make sounds at me. 3 of the appendages are longer than the 4th, so it mostly wobbles around in crooked little circles. It is getting bigger, and it never stops changing. I was hoping it would stay and become some sort of indiscernible monster, but now I am sure that it is becoming a person. Or at the very least something similar. I would like to kill it. I wonder if I could. ch4 The appendages are even now. It's disgusting, with abhorrent little limbs forming perfectly. They're currently flippers and nubs, cartilage and bright blue veins under translucent white skin. It sits and stares at me as the cat did, but instead of curiosity it looks on with a hunger and a disquieting energy, just as the cat's did. However, its eyes reflect the slightest light in the darkness. They're omnipresent and white and green and yellow as I try to sleep. The eyes are not, yet, the same size, which only serves to make the thing more unnerving. Ch5 It sits at the top of the stairs, waiting for me, smiling down at me with crooked reflective eyes and a small mouth full of small black teeth. My bedroom is upstairs. I am afraid to go up. It also has hands and feet now. The nubs gave way to small, slender fingers and toes. It is beginning to walk and climb about, and there are small white handprints smudged on all of the doorknobs. I think at this point towels will do me no good. Ch6 It can open doors. I'm sure of it now. It's androgynous in anatomy, but for him I think it male. It still smiles at me and stares, but says nothing. A small mercy. Ch7 Last night I picked up a fairy-tale anthology and decided to read it while resting in the rocking chair next to my bedroom window. In response, the accursed thing stood in my doorway, leering at me, intent to ruin any escape. It succeeded. Frustration and fear gave way to rage, and I pushed up the window, ripped a hole in the screen, and flung the book outside into the night. The thing ventured down the stairs, in and out the front door, and brought the book back an arm snaking against and over the arm of my chair, depositing the small book in my lap, complete with bony handprint. That was the closest it had ever gotten to me. I became frightened. I stared at the thing and then tossed the old book to the carpet. To only have to deal with a beating beneath the floorboards. This thing mocked me and tormented me and lived and breathed and watched. It looked at the book for a moment, then curled up in the corner and stared at me, large uneven eyes with skin pulled back around. It stared at me and smiled with its little teeth. Ch8. The thing has started polluting my food or hiding it or both, and I found that shampoo burns my scalp and razors jut from the pages of my books. No longer content to mull around and lurk in corners, it is now actively making my life miserable. Ch9 Eventually, I had no choice but to venture out to the local supermarket and replace my now useless toiletries and food. I had become accustomed to it staying at my home, content to violate my private space, but I always held a suspicion it would begin to follow me. My fear was confirmed. I drove to the store, did my shopping, and checked out. Nothing unusual happened. I walked outside. Nothing. I approached my car and believed to have seen it, but had not. I then glanced up and saw it. It was far away. I do not know if it was making an attempt to hide, but it was there, looking at me, half hidden behind the tree. Our eyes met, and I shivered. It appeared pleased, then it crawled its thin body back behind the tree, paused, and stuck its head out to continue watching me. The eyes were even, but they seemed to be getting larger, and darker, and more vacant. Even from the distance between the two of us they stood out much against the bleached skin that surrounded them. It smiled, but showed no teeth. I suppose it did not want to show them in public. I wondered what it had planned for me. I blinked and it was gone. I paused for a moment, worried it would appear somewhere closer, but nothing happened. I then packed up the groceries and returned home. I stopped, retrieved my mail, pulled up, parked, got out, glanced up, and a light happened to catch my eye. I saw a foreign light my bedroom window. Faintly silhouetted against my window was the thing, staring intently down at me, shuddering against the glass, violating my room. I'm sure it had been watching the entire time, waiting for me to notice. In silhouette it looked so much like a person now, though was really little more than a lumpy childlike skeleton with enormous dark eyes. If I killed it, would the authorities come back and blame me for killing a person? I wondered if it would try to snake a hand through the hole in the screen and reach for me. Ch11 Last night I sat on the couch flipping channels, desperate for any distraction or escape. The phone was next to me, but I was too afraid to call anyone for help, lest what happened before be found out. It must be said, though, that the pressure was becoming unbearable. It sat in his corner again, sat in a sphinx-like position despite looking so human now. And just as I hit the one channel with static for the umpteenth time, the thing in the corner began to whisper. I ignored it and changed the channel, hoping it would shut up. Its whispering merely grew in speed and intensity, and while it did not move, its eyes reflected the television screen and widened and its small chest heaved as it rattled off. I turned up the volume and began flipping rapidly, infomercial then sports channel then a cartoon, then suddenly his face was on the screen, tongue lolling out in blue face gasping for air and mercy, and the thing was in front of me and in front of the television, facing me, gibbering and staring, and I screamed over it and the television and the room went dark. Ch12 This is too much, and I understand now the extent of blind terror the idea of certain death instinctively brings about in people. I have known the thrill of killing and the fear of being caught, but neither the idea of retribution nor of my life itself ending were ever real to me. The mere thought of this thing, however, drives a black and bleak and cold and nearly unbearable fear to my core, let alone the feeling that I get when I feel it mulling about my room at night or when I awake to find small bruises, cuts, and white chalky smudges on my person. I want to kill it, but I don't know what would happen if I tried. I don't know what to do. Ch13 I'll say it here, maybe it will help. It has been a while, but I killed him. It's all clean, but I did it. He looked at me and looked at me and looked at me and would not stop. I should have known he would never stop. I knocked him down and strangled him until his throat collapsed under my thumbs and I dumped the body somewhere far away. At first I had nightmares about him screaming, then wheezing, then his eyes and skin bursting like blood and confetti. I had them every night. Then the police left, and I was left to read in my warm bed with my cat sleeping alongside me or pulling at the pages. The investigation ceased, the nightmares ceased, and I was at peace. Then the humming started. The humming and the warmth all over, and I can see its reflection in my computer monitor. Ch14 My home, my bed, my person, and now my dreams. I'm having nightmares again, but they're much, much worse. In my dreams it's there. It has no eyes, but it stands tall and with its wide mouth and talks to me and laughs at me and screams and looks ready to devour me. Sometimes I understand its words and sometimes they're incomprehensible, but whenever I wake up I cannot remember their precise nature. The dreams feel dark and hot and cramped, and I wonder if anything worse could possibly happen to me if I die. I wonder if it would depend on if it killed me or if someone else did. Ch15 Maybe I will do it. I have a pistol in a box in my bedroom closet, and if I were to fling the thing from its watching place down the stairs it would give me enough time to run and grab the gun. I just wouldn't be sure who to use it on. I have worried about the thing reading these entries and figuring out my intentions, but I have not seen any evidence of it examining the keyboard or monitor. I comfort myself in regards to this matter by believing that its form of comprehension is much too primal and hunger-driven to allow for much complex thought. Maybe I'm a fool. Maybe it knows everything. Regardless, it's in my dreams and my brain and every waking moment, and I am determined to end it. Ch16 I found my solution. I purchased a shotgun. If we're both within range when I pull the trigger, it should do the trick. Wish me luck. Ch17 Why didn't I die? Why didn't it die? Ch18 I don't understand. I cleaned the carpet after before, but now it's soaked with blood. I wonder if with the way my head is, looking at it is like a mirror, because I bled like a person and the thing bled black and it's all everywhere, and I haven't looked in the mirror, but I blasted half of its skull off and there are bits of red and blue flesh everywhere, and it's still looking at me, leering at me, smiling at me, spurting and bleeding at me. The keyboard is covered in my blood and I don't know how long I can keep this up. I only have one idea left. I think I am going to go far away. Written above are the journal entries of Christopher Young, found dead in a rock quarry next to the mutilated, partially decomposed, and recently moved remains of Sean Dawes, his young neighbor and former friend. Dawes's death was one of head trauma followed by strangulation, but Young's cause of death is as of yet undetermined. though he was malnourished and his hygienic state was in vast disrepair. In fact, thanks to his physical and mental state leading up to his death, it is uncertain how he managed to drive the relatively great length from his home to the quarry in which he ended up. It is also worth mentioning that neither fresh blood nor any of the firearms Young mentions in his writing were found in his home. All our forensics team found were older traces on the carpet and mantel corner that likely belonged to Dawes. We're currently probing autopsy reports for any information they can provide on Young's mental health from Dawes's death onward and requesting further investigation by every department involved. All we have to go on in regards to Young apart from his cadaver's physical state and these entries is virtually nil. As of my writing this, we haven't come up with a single witness or piece of evidence outside of what I mentioned above, apart from an interview with Daryl, Christopher's brother. To be frank with you, even said interview with was fruitless. He was distraught at the death of his younger brother, but said that Young seemed perfectly content and had claimed he was going on a vacation and that his cat would only need to be taken care of for about a week minimum. The two bodies were found 5 days later in the quarry, meaning that if the older of the Young brothers is being truthful, and isn't afflicted with his brother's psychosis, Young's physical and mental deterioration happened much more quickly than we had first assumed, and much more quickly than should have been possible. I'll keep you updated as we learn more, of course. It's all very strange. Thanks for the help. Yours truly, Police Department. Credited to Strussai. Post views, 5108. Please wait.